Rongotha, which is, of course, Fijian for Achtung, Achtung. A huge thank you to listener Matt Wiggins for that. Matt's mum grew up in Fiji and met his dad when he was there with the Peace Corps. Yep, that's right. If there was one military unit you'd want to join, it's the Peace Corps. Nothing can happen to you, is there? Right, well, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the podcast in the front line of Second World War history. Not so much in the front line as trapped behind enemy lines with dwindling ammo and the enemy have cut off the water. James, how are you? Today.
Finished off reading The Ship, which I woke up this morning listening to the bird song. Obviously, light pouring into the back of the Dodge, and finished the last couple of chapters of The Ship.
It's gripping, isn't it?
God, I love that book.
He's Forrester has that get inside someone's head thing, doesn't he? That he's really good at. He's really, really good at.
Absolutely amazing. And it just felt right, didn't it? You just felt you were in good hands as someone taking you through the workings of a light cruiser in an action against the Italian fleet in early 1942.
No, it's excellent. I've just been reading about the Ark Royal's first attempted attack on the Bismarck, in which they fired 18 torpedoes at the Sheffield. God. And luckily they all failed. I mean,
thank goodness for that.
Imagine that as the story of the attempt to sink the Bismarck, part one.
Oh my God! Yeah.
You know, as blue on blue goes, if they'd put 18 torpedoes into the Sheffield, I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
They all get back
really
there, and you know the bollocking they must have got when they got back as well.
Yeah. You realise, don't you, that there's so much of I mean, I'm sure the overall course of the war wouldn't have changed dramatically, but there are lots of small things that could have still radically changed things, couldn't it? A sort of decision here, a moment there, a chance miss. You've
also got to ask if let's say those swordfish, and it is. I mean, reading the accounts of like getting a swordfish going on a carrier in a pitching sea. So you know that 1 minute they're pushing, 20 guys pushing the swordfish uphill, and then the ship tips and it's running downhill. I mean, just the whole thing is like absolutely. But if they had sunk the Sheffield, that would have got covered up. There's absolute. They'd have gone. Oh, the Bismarck got it. Bismarck got the Sheffield. It wasn't the Fleet Air Arm. And then someone would have gone. Oh no, it wasn't. Do you know what I mean? That would be one of those. It would have turned into one of those great. I mean, there'd be a Channel 4 documentary, wouldn't there? Forgotten story of the Sheffield. Blah blah blah. With James Holland.
I remember interviewing. Just very quickly, though. I remember interviewing a guy called Nat Gold, who had been a Fairey Swordfish wireless operator air gunner on a swordfish operating from Malta.
Yeah,
bloke at the back, and you know, you just sort of. Okay, so it is open cockpit. You know, it really is. And what they would do is they would go and mine Tripoli Harbour and things like that.
Yeah.
Or Benghazi or something like that.
Yeah.
And so they'd take off from Malta, fly at night across the Mediterranean. And then what you do, at 6,000 feet, you know, you'd cut the engine.
Glide in.
To try and sort of give yourself a chance against the kind of harbour anti-aircraft installation so they wouldn't be able to hear you coming in.
Yeah.
And then you'd get in really low, sort of several hundred feet off the deck, drop your torpedo, and then try and start the engine again and hope it all went well, and fly back to Malta. That's nerves of steel, isn't it, to do that?
I mean, it is interesting, though, isn't it? Because the swordfish, after all, is the state-of-the-art marine assault weapons platform in 1938, isn't it?
Yeah. How quickly things move on,
and it's it is quite incredible, and because you know in those Bismarck attacks they're flying in 150 feet above the sea, and the splashes from the Bismarck's AA, you know, it's 100-foot columns of seawater. I mean, as danger goes. Anyway, parish notices first. We had record numbers on our live show on Thursday. 553 of you, stout yeomen of the independent company and yo women, joined us for what has become a feature-length production. 90 minutes of pure We Have Ways of Making You Talk tangential
it was supposed to be an hour, wasn't it?
It was supposed to be an hour. It's meant to be an hour. Well, you know, it's always an estimate, isn't it? I mean, the war was meant to be over by Christmas 1940, so there you go.
Fair point. Can't argue with that.
The highlight for me was us doing a Stalin reenactment sketch. I thought that was particularly strong.
I love that story about Rokossovsky, though. He's actually a very cool guy, and he did write his memoirs. And I think they're only kind of, you know, as leading
Soviet
marshals
memoirs go,
it's reasonably close to the truth.
I imagine. Yeah, that did not happen. Oh,
okay. I see in my early edition of the Times this morning that Ben Wheatley's stirring things up with his
Prokhorovka stuff. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's the sort of because there was the gap in the archive basically in Russia where you could go and have a look.
That's right.
And have a proper look, and it's closed again for sort of nationalist political reasons, and and so he won't be allowed to go to Russia, will he? That's what'll happen. But there have been German historians who've been banned from going and looking at the Russian archive, and whose work has been banned from Russia because they're basically going, well, when you look at it's not the biggest tank battle of all time, and secondly, it's this sort of fantastically Pyrrhic victory on the part of the Soviets they're completely, they are almost, one of the Guards' armies, I think, is whole divisions lost, are written down, and then of course. Then, of course, you get this. Roman Topol writes about this in his book about Kursk. That the then Red Army doctrine is based on what they have told themselves happened at Kursk, and of course that isn't what happened at Kursk. So, or rather, Soviet Army after the post-war. So they end up with this doctrine that's based on a censored version of events.
That didn't happen.
Yeah, which is, I think, really quite interesting.
But the Kursk salient was sort of like the lines of Torres Vedras times a million, wasn't it? I mean, it was like 7, wasn't it? 7 defensive lines, because there was the ones behind Kursk as well.
Yeah. Well,
I think the Germans never penetrated more than 2, did they?
I think it's 2, and the Soviets knew that the Germans were going to try something. But when you compare it to the offensives of the year before, it's Vickers Tea Party stuff. That it just shows how played out the Germans are. Because what the Germans are trying to do is straighten the line rather than drive to the Volga proper or get to Moscow or you know what I mean. It shows sort of how their ambitions have been pared back by what they can actually can or can't achieve. Anyway,
and the fact that if the Allies attack in the Mediterranean, they're going to call it off.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's huge debates in June about whether they even do it at all.
Call that off, even given the fact it's not a big offensive. Is the thing? It shows actually how limited they are. Anyway, we've what we've done there. We've digressed the way we do when we talk on a Thursday in the livecast. And this week we are delighted to let you know that we have the brilliant Philippe Sands joining us on Thursday evening. You may well have heard his recent appearances on the pod talking about East West Street and the Rat Line, and it's incredibly exciting that Philippe is going to join us and hopefully be able to get his head around the chaos as it emerges.
Will his legal mind be able to cope with the?
No comment. Right, he'll be answering your questions live on Thursday. Get them into us via Twitter, email, or the Independent Company site, our Patreon, and we'll get as many answered as we can. So please do. And, of course, on the message stream on the side, I'm sure somebody will be chipping in. Also, Gurglebox is nearly with us. Have you all got your Band of Brothers box sets? Or have you bought it?
It just makes me laugh every time I see it.
Well, I am waiting to hear from their lawyers. Have you got your Band of Brothers box sets, or have you brought it from Now TV or Amazon Prime? They're all available. It's out there, Band of Brothers. It's easy to get hold of. We'll announce the starting date this Thursday during the livecast. And we have another event beginning next Monday, daily for a week. This is very exciting.
Just roll one off the other, don't they?
Oh, exactly. As you probably know, James runs a very successful history festival each year at Chalk Valley. And it's not happening this year because nothing else is either, for obvious reasons. So instead, we're offering you a digital version, punningly entitled, and you know what? I'm ashamed how long it took us to think of this, called We Have Ways of Making You Chalk. You know what? Why did I have to come up with that? It's your history festival.
Because you do the gags, everyone knows that.
Well, that's quite true. Yeah, exactly. My laser sharp mind took a whole year and a half to think about. It's always about being.
I walked up the festival site yesterday, though, and it was looking very, very beautiful and very, very empty, and it's really sad because this should be the big build this week. Tents should be going up, lots of hubbub, lots of activity, excitement in the air, and all the rest of it. So we're having to sort of redirect our excitement a little bit to We Have Ways of Making You Chalk.
But it must be frantic about now with the festival running for you?
Yeah, it's great. Well, it's
Rachel?
particularly frankly for Rachel, because she's sort of site operations schools festival. That's her bit. I do all the programming, or I'm one of the people that does all the programming. So for me, my work is over until the actual festival comes, because then I'm sort of careering around like a blue ass. What's it? But
so you're not booking. Would you be like? I mean, backing Portaloos into the site and all that.
No, I'm not doing that stuff. I'm not doing that stuff. In the old days, yes, but not now. Not now. I'll just be beetling around in my Dodge, showing off and annoying everybody. Yeah. No. Anything you want me to do? Anything you want put in the back? I was looking forward to that.
I can't get it in gear. See you later.
How rude! That's the only bit I'm struggling with the gears is going from fourth to third. But I think I finally nailed it yesterday. That's the only thing. But right. Going up through the gears, I'm nailing it. What? So anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to veer off Second World War just for 1 week only, and don't worry, we're not leaving it for long. And we're not actually leaving it entirely, are we? Because I think everyone we've got on has got some tenuous link to the Second World War somewhere along the line.
Correct.
So we've got Michael Wood, the legend that is Mike Wood, who is just so brilliant. It's not true. And I used to just love all these programs he used to do in search of the Dark Ages, in search of Trojan War, the footsteps of Alexander, etc. And he's terrific. And he's going to be talking about the story of China. But actually, he had relatives on D-Day. And obviously China played a not insignificant role in the Second World War, not that most people know that. Yeah. And so we've got him. We've got Nora Krug, who's rather brilliant. Yeah. She's a German girl living in New York, and she's written this brilliant book. What it's like being German and the legacy and reckoning with the past and all the rest of it. So we thought that'd be really
grips with her family's past, and therefore what it means to be German.
Yeah,
what her Heimat truly is.
Yes. Yes.
It's a brilliant book. I can't wait to talk to her.
We going back to Second World. We have got a day on the road with a T-34, which should have been at Chalk Valley, but we've got that. So that will be us out and about, which will be exciting. We've got Gary Sheffield talking about the 30 Years' War, but not the 30 Years' War of the mid-17th century. The 30 Years' War of 1914 to 1945. So again, a nod to the Second World War, but kind of that big picture stuff. We've got Tim Bouverie talking about Chamberlain, the Apostle of Peace in the 1930s. And we've got Andrew Zeminski, who's a stonemason, whose father was a Pole, forced to fight for the Germans, ended up being a POW, learned his trade as a stonemason in Scotland as a POW, passed it on to his son. His son has now done all sorts of amazing stuff, worked on the West Kennet Long Barrow, worked at Salisbury Cathedral, the Roman Baths, all the rest of it. So big history stuff, big ideas, and he's a lovely fellow. And then we're hoping to get Professor Ali Ansari on as well. He's an Iranian scholar, but also a big advocate of the Union of the United Kingdom.
Interesting. Okay, well, there you go. So that's We Have Ways of Making You Chalk, which will be... I mean, come on. Come on, James. You should be ashamed of yourself that you have to rely on me to come out with that pun.
I am a bit.
I mean, we even did a We Have Ways of Making You Talk at Chalk, and it didn't occur to us last year. We did one at the festival, live, and it didn't occur to us. What a pair of complete muppets! Right, okay.
Anyway.
Now, as many of you know, we don't know everything, and we're happy to occasionally let our polite listeners feel so emboldened as to point this out to us. And we've had an email from the presumably geriatric Gordon Skillen, and it says, "Dear Al and James, I did enjoy today's podcast and was amused by the comparison of the current government's handling of the coronavirus with the process of rearmament in the late 1930s. I'd love to say I hate to point it out. But that's a lie, and I hope that your podcast at least tolerates nerdy corrections of this sort.
It certainly does.
Al referenced stockpiles of Spitfires, which brought a smile to my face because I'm sure you know the Air Ministry nearly cancelled the Spitfire because Supermarine was so far behind in its production schedule. In 1936, Supermarine was a company more used to producing orders of dozens of flying boats, and before fulfilling an order for 310 aircraft could even be thought about, the factory at Wootton in Southampton had to be rebuilt, and the number of skilled staff nearly doubled. The first Spitfire was not delivered until December 37, 9 months later than scheduled. Due to problems with subcontractors, only 306 had been delivered to frontline squadrons by the time the war started. At one point, 80 fuselages had been produced, but no wings, forcing Supermarine to take wing production back in-house and reassign fitters from their own production lines to build them. Then there was the shadow factory at Castle Bromwich in Birmingham, which had been designed along the lines of a car factory, which failed to produce a single Spitfire by May 1940. According to Alfred Price's book, The Spitfire Story, the problem was with constantly having to change the production line tooling to fit an aircraft that was, at this stage, in a state of continuous modification. According to Supermarine employee C.R. Russell, writing in his book Spitfire Odyssey, there were other issues, including strikes and industrial action by the workforce at Castle Bromwich. Castle Bromwich was a sick joke in aviation circles, as test pilot Alex Henshaw admits years later. Minister of Aircraft Production Lord Beaverbrook took personal control of the situation. At great effort, 10 Spitfires were produced by the factory. The 10 in June was flaunted to the press, largely to cover up the complete mess that had been holding up production beforehand. Luckily, the Castle Bromwich factory was up to speed when the factories at Southampton and Eastleigh were heavily damaged by a bomber raid in September 1940. For these reasons, the Spitfire is very close to being cancelled and the factory's production changed to Bristol Beaufighters. Luckily, the Battle of France proved the Spitfire's worth, and the rest, as they say, is history. It seems that whatever the crisis, the same problems will appear. Keep up the good work, Gordon Skillen.
Well, I don't think we just didn't mention any of that. It's not a question that we obviously didn't know it, Al. Lord Swinton was sacked as a result of this.
Yeah, Castle Bromwich was a byword for the Shadow Factory thing.
Yeah, and it was the guy who was... Yeah, what's his name? Who owned Morris, wasn't it? And he was absolutely hopeless, and he was sacked. But another casualty of that was Lord Swinton, who actually had been instrumental in setting up the Shadow Factories in the first place, and he was the one who had to kind of he was the fall guy in all this.
Yeah, he had to take the rap, didn't he? Yeah,
he took the rap, but he ended up being the head of the Secret Intelligence Service, so it wasn't that bad a swap, really. And he survived, and and he was, Lord Swinton is a sort of forgotten figure, but he was absolutely instrumental because he was a great backer of Dowding when Dowding was head of research and development, and was very instrumental in making sure that Dowding had the latitude to create the system, the air defence system. Yeah. So he's very involved in that, and also very involved in setting up these shadow factories in the first place. It's just that the shadow factory. It was the operations of the shadow factories that didn't work, not the principle. Yeah. And Beaverbrook. So Seb Cox, who we had on the other day, he thinks I'm overly generous to Beaverbrook. He thinks that actually,
I did wonder.
All the work had been done beforehand, and that Beaverbrook arrived at precisely the moment where it was all starting to come to fruition. But Gordon is absolutely right about the fraught process of the Spitfire, and of course the reason it was so fraught is because the Spitfire is an incredibly complex machine to build, and it's so radically different from anything else that's come before. The Hurricane works because it is basically an adaptation of a biplane that's just been turned into a monoplane. But if you look at the fuselage in profile, it's exactly the same as a Nimrod or a...
Well, I think what's illustrative is the problem Hawker then has when they switch to proper metal monocoque aircraft.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that if you want to, because like you say, the Hurricane is bigger single wing, but it's still a fabric on metal design and all that sort of stuff. So it's a complete inheritor of pre-monocoque metal design, fuselage design, in particular fuselage design. And
it's all Irish linen on the fuselage.
Well, exactly. So in fact, what Supermarine do, and the other thing, because Supermarine, like Gordon very rightly points out, they're a boat plane manufacturer. And then they get snaffled up by Vickers because they've come up with this single seat fighter that is probably the government's probably going to order tons of. I mean, the Vickers are speculating to accumulate here when they take Supermarine on with that aircraft, thinking right, okay. It's that thing of, like you say, Mitchell. I mean, and I'm looking at my groovy paperweight while we talk about this concentric aluminium rectangle spar design. He's designing a radical new aircraft. Vickers take it on. It's really it's difficult, isn't it? As proved by all the aircraft Hawker come up with that do not work. And
exactly that.
The effort it takes them to get to the Typhoon even being safe to fly. Yeah. Without the pilot being gassed. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This is difficult stuff. The sort of head start that the Germans have in this is that they made up their minds that 18 months earlier that they were going to do this. So they have they have equivalent aircraft ready 18 months earlier, basically. It's kind of as simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, the difficulty is always is getting the machine tools and training up the staff. And I do remember when... So we were talking with Mike Nyberg the other day about the kind of, the whole change around and the sudden kind of dramatic rearming of under Roosevelt in the summer of 1940. And one of the first things the Roosevelt does in the in May and June is create this advisory committee made up of industrialists and big businessmen. Edward Stetnus, who's a steel magnate, and one of the key players is this guy called Bill Knudsen, who is a Dane who's come over in 1900, and he's the guy who's kind of sort of helped Ford develop the conveyor line. And also is the guy who's transformed General Motors, leaves Ford because he has an argument with Ford over kind of, he says you need to change the Model T. It's getting boring. Everyone, you need to make cars aspirational and change them every time and constantly evolve them. Ford disagrees. He leaves, takes over General Motors, and by the beginning of the war, he's head of General Motors. And he says to when Roosevelt calls him up, he says, "Mr. President, what you've got to understand is this: it's going to take 6 months to build the machine tools, 6 months to train the staff." And then 6 months before you're going to see anything substantial. So you're right. Your 18 months line is as a rule of thumb, is about right. And obviously, in the case of America, conveniently, 18 months from June 1940 is December 1941, which of course is when they come into the war.
Well, it's the thing Adam Tooze talks about as well in Wages of Destruction, when he says Spear inherits the organisation Todd and the fighter drive. Basically, the point where it's kicking off, and then goes, look, it was me. And in fact, he's getting the fruit of other people's efforts. I mean, it's a lot like when Hitler comes to power, that the Weimar economic reforms are all kicking in, and it looks like it's him.
Exactly that.
And the lots of these things that take a long time. I mean, the other thing that I am casting my mind back to my degree now, is I remember reading because we did the cabinet papers in the run up. We did the cabinet papers literally up to Chamberlain going, right, okay, well then we'll declare war on the Germans, and all the stuff war related. And at one point, Chamberlain, the cabinet are debating building Spitfires for two reasons. The first is, what about Germany? The second is, well, we need to keep our skilled machinists in work, and we need to keep those skills going. And maybe, who knows, if we do build a load of Spitfires, what it'll do is it'll cause knock-on into other industries where these guys will go and get jobs as skilled machinists doing other things, because we need to keep our skilled sector afloat. Because after all, that national government is building council houses, is doing all sorts of other stuff to keep the economy going post Great Depression. And one of the things they're using is rearmament. To do that. I mean, just like, in fact, the Germans aren't. The Germans are using rearmament to rearm. The Chamberlain government are partly doing it with an eye to the economic ramifications of doing it. It's really, I mean, anyway. But an excellent point there, Gordon. Thank you very much for chipping in. We have to take a break. I just need to make sure the machine tools are all gleaming. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Thanks for all your support in recent weeks. 527,499 downloads in the past 30 days, but none of them aimed at the enemy. That's the statistic, which is a fantastic amount of people taking an interest in the Second World War, and in our take on it. By the way, I've started a new book for independent company members on the Patreon. It's Pierre Costerman's The Big Show, which is a brilliant account of the war in the air from a French pilot's perspective. A fantastic book. I've nearly finished it. The last bits are so good, isn't it? Yeah.
Tempest in 1945. Whoa.
But his dealings with the... I mean, the other... Well, okay, Lena, let's stay on that. The thing that keeps becoming clearer and clearer and clearer, is that those last 6 months
were awful.
Were horrendous. And
horrendous.
The butcher's bill... And this is at a time where the Allies are, the Germans have lost, and before Wacht am Rhein, the Germans have lost. There's no doubt about it. you've got to. The only way you're going to beat them is by grinding them down and fighting them and winkling them out, and that costs men's lives. And the Allied air forces may well have air supremacy, but that, to enforce that, costs. And you can have cleared the skies of the Luftwaffe all you like, but the anti-aircraft that the Germans
it's amazing.
Are capable
it's such an eye-opener, isn't it? It's such an eye-opener, and it's just the sort of the casual violence in which Red 2 gets blown up and Blue 3 gets destroyed, and suddenly they come back from a sortie and another 2 are gone. And that doesn't sound like very many, but in a squadron of kind of 24 chaps, that's a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
Particularly if it's happening every day.
Because he talks about going to Volkel, in Holland, and he's based out of there in Tempests. And that they've got Me-262s to keep an eye on. It's the new threat, and they do regard it as a threat because of how quick it is, more than anything else. And they are, and he gets there, and they've lost 12 guys in the last 3 weeks or something, and it's obviously chip, and like you say, I mean, this is piling up, and the idea that kind of it's all over bar the sort of bar the battle for Berlin, which is seen as the big sort of headline battle of the end of the war. It's just it doesn't add up at all, and that you've really got and you've got Germany actually in its death throes for a long time. And this thing of clinging on and making the Allies pay dear, and it's really interesting, and it's the sort of thing that you come back to. Anyway, let's do a question, and I've tried to do it in a bit more like he's a very sort of considered French guy, so I've tried to make it a bit more considered in the way I've read it.
You speak in a French accent when you read it?
No, I don't speak in a French accent, but it's more So it was a wonderful day. I'm trying to be a bit more. I've tried to sit back on it a bit more.
Nice.
It's not like Xeno where it's like hours of frantic shit scramble. There's some... He also, what's really interesting is he absolutely loves his aircraft. He loves them. And the way he talks about Spitfires and the way he talks about the Tempest when he first gets his hands on one, he loves these planes and goes into... and you've got horsepower details and everything. Right down... If you're a warbird nerd... God, it's more difficult than I thought it was. That if you're a warbird nerd, it's right there for you. All that and what it's like, and the whole thing that they have to fire in the winter. They have to fire the Tempests up every 45 minutes because otherwise they'll never get the oil flow going and the plane will blow up.
I just loved that book. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. He's a very good looking lad as well, actually, wasn't he, Pierre Closterman?
Yeah. He's the full French fighter pilot package, isn't he? I can't get my teeth in this morning. Okay. So we have a question from David Bentley via Twitter direct message. Hi chaps, obligatory but genuine opening paragraph about loving the podcast, long time listener, etc. Keep up the amazing work. You're helping thousands of us get through lockdown in splendid style. Well, it's our pleasure, David. Let me tell you that. I was listening to your fascinating specials on Dunkirk and the fall of France, and you got me thinking, is it possible that there were British holidaymakers enjoying a break in France, Belgium and Holland pre-Fall Gelb in May 1940? Would UK civilians have been allowed to travel to regions close to a potential war zone? If so, how were they evacuated? Did any civilians come out through Dunkirk? And as a connected question, what happened to the staff of the Commonwealth Wargrave Commission cemeteries in northern France and Belgium once the German army arrived? Hope someone can shed some light on this in a future episode. All the best to everyone on the We Have Ways team.
Well, a little bit. There's a brilliant brace of books by Edward Spears, so Lieutenant General Sir Edward Spears. Now, Ed Spears is a really interesting guy. We mentioned him a few weeks ago on the Dunkirk specials. He was Churchill's special envoy out in France. He was an absolutely fluent French speaker. Been brought up in France. Had worked on as a sort of liaison officer on French staffs during the First World War. Anyway, he's on holiday in France in August 1939, and all his friends are kind of going, "This is it. It's all over. This is the last holiday you'll be able to enjoy." And once war is declared, he then drives back to the Channel ports and with his wife, and he's full of kind of loss and sadness that it's all over.
It's over.
And this is it for a long time. So the long and short of it is that no, you couldn't really travel to France after that. I mean, you could, but you couldn't, if you sort of mean. Holiday season was over. They were at war. I don't think it was. I don't think there was a rule like sort of if you go over, you've got to self-isolate for 2 weeks, but but just people just weren't really doing it. And of course, by the time war breaks out, it's September and it's kind of sort of holiday season sort of over. There's this kind of sort of feeling that it's kind of disrespectful to go off and go on holiday when. Yeah. But of course, because it happens at the beginning of September, there are lots of people who are on holiday at the time war is declared, and Spears is absolutely not alone at all. In terms of Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries, the Germans are incredibly respectful about them, actually. And they do. They just carry on. I mean, there's lots of stuff. I mean, so if you go to the Menin Gate, there's lots of shrapnel marks from 1940 on the outside of the Menin Gate. Hitler visited it and his tour just before he went to Paris, or was it just after? I can't remember. He did a motorised tour and he went to Ypres and there's a very famous photo of him by a brick wall with some of his comrades, and he found his comrades and he took the same photo again and reenacted it and stuff like that. But no, Germans were generally very, very respectful of those cemeteries, and so the guys were able to carry on looking after them.
Right, okay. Now, David Dickinson, who's an independent company member, who I believe got a question on the live cast the other
God,
day.
He's doing well, isn't he?
He is. He's keen. I like it.
In between the furniture stuff.
He says, collaboration. We all have our own views on this born of seeing France succumb to the Vichy regime. Not only helping to identify Jews and other political agitators, supporting their capture and transfer to camps, but also reporting their neighbours to the German authorities for any number of infringements. There is also perhaps a romantic notion of the French resistance which has garnered widespread attention. Then suddenly everyone was in the resistance June-July 44. Even the surname of a collaborator in Norwegian has entered our English vocabulary. Quisling is not an endearing description. My question is, what would the Brits have done if Operation Sea Lion had succeeded? I know, but go with it for a minute. Would there have been a Vichy equivalent? How strong committed would the resistance have been? Would all the Brits have resisted and joined formal groups? It's easy to criticise occupied populations, but to be fair to them, we were not under Nazi rule for 4 years. Would we risk the reprisals and stick it to them? I like to think so, but after this lockdown and people reporting others to the police for alleged infringements, I'm not so sure. Well, it's the sort of SSGB, Len Dayton thing, isn't it? I mean, you know what? There were all sorts of dodgy characters, definitely sympathetic to Hitler in British politics, including David Lloyd George. I mean, for former prime ministers.
I think there's a high chance that he'd have been prime minister again, or Oswald Mosley, and all those guys that were put in. There were a hell of a lot of people were put into prison, detained. For having extremist views, and was the British Union a fascist and all the rest of it? British Union fascists. I mean, they never took grip in the same way that obviously the Nazis did. But don't forget that when the Nazis came to power, they only came to power with 33% of the vote, and that percentage has only really recently grown. I mean, up until kind of 1931, they were still a kind of a bit of a joke. Things can change very, very quickly, and you've only got to look around the country, and you've got to look at those sort of the right wing types kind of sort of beating up people at the weekend over I'm going to defend my statue and all that kind of stuff, and you realise that Britain is not short of people who would want to be collaborating with Nazis.
Yeah, and you've also got
the long and short of it is yes, of course there would be people who would collaborate. 100%.
And they'd have been able to scrape a government together of people prepared to do that. I think. Am I right in thinking that the American embassy did a thing where it pretended it had a guy pretending to be a German consul asking people what their position would be should Britain fall, and they got basically a list. I can't remember where I read that. Ended up with a list as long as their arm of people going. Well, if I had to, of course, and it would be for the sake of the country to because after all, the other thing you've got to factor in is people who want a quiet life who think, well, the best thing to do is cooperate with them, and that will make it. That will mitigate it. In fact, Anne Applebaum wrote a really good, really, really, really good piece the week before last about collaborators and about she wrote it about East Germany and about France and about the Republican Party and people in the Republican Party now who. Because if you broke with the party in East Germany, in the DDR, you'd get gulagged or the East German equivalent, right? and there was a Stasi and all that sort of thing. And she's saying, so, you know, you can see the price of of basically not conforming with the state is a high price, which she's saying, and she says, well, but you look at American Republicans, what's actually the price of not conforming with with Trump? What's actually the cost? You aren't gonna be gulagged. You aren't gonna lose your livelihood and all those sort of things. Why are people going along with it? And it's a really interesting. I can't remember what it's called. It's Anne Applebaum. And I can't remember, I think it's in the New York Times. It's something like that. And it's a really, really interesting, cool-headed thing going, why are people going along this? It's because it's literally the path of least resistance. It's just easier. It's just simpler and for people. And also power has that magnetism, doesn't it? That makes people go, I mean, we've talked about, with Philippe, we talked about educated lawyers, ambitious people thinking going with the power and the politics of the Nazis, but power being that real proper attraction to people. And there definitely would have been people who felt like that here. I mean, I suppose is, you know, would Halifax have led a Vichy Britain? Probably not. It would have been someone far less kind of savoury, wouldn't it?
I just can't bear. I can't watch. I can read SSGB. I can watch SSGB. I can't watch Resistance. I don't want to know or hear about anything that involves swastikas flying over England. I find the whole thing. It's a really, really deep, weird thing that I literally just can't bear it. I can't bear seeing, you know, right-wing neo-fascist thugs in our streets either. Of course, I find the whole thing so deeply distasteful.
Well, I couldn't agree
Fiction
more.
or for real.
Couldn't agree more, James. Well, that's all we've got time for today, I'm afraid. We're back on Thursday. On that note, on that bombshell, we're back on Thursday with our regular weekly second podcast. Plus, we'll be live streaming Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m. UK time. And we'd love for as many of you as possible to join us, as we've got the wonderful Philippe Sands joining us live, and he's going to answer a load of your questions. That is a real treat. I'm very excited about that happening. See you all soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.